It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in September, the kind where the air smells faintly of apples and anticipation. At precisely 3:15 p.m., Linda adjusted her navy gown in the mirror of the bridal suite at Oak Ridge Vineyards. The venue buzzed with activity, the string quartet tuning their instruments, waitstaff bustling with trays, and Sophie, her 26-year-old daughter, pacing nervously with her bouquet. "You look perfect," Linda said, smoothing Sophie's veil. Her smile was genuine, though the tightness in her chest reminded her that she was balancing on the edge of a cliff. In the corner, Henry, Linda's husband of nearly 30 years, joked with Matthew, Sophie's fiancé. They laughed easily, Henry's hearty chuckle filling the room. Linda's gaze lingered on them, guilt bubbling under her polished exterior. She had kept her secret locked away for months. The stolen evenings, the whispered phone calls, the affair. David Montgomery, her boss, had been a distraction at first, a charming, magnetic force in her otherwise predictable life. Their connection started over late-night work sessions, but quickly spiraled into clandestine dinners and hotel rooms. Linda justified it by telling herself that she deserved more than the lukewarm companionship she and Henry had fallen into. But today, as her family stood on the brink of celebrating a new beginning, the weight of her choices pressed heavily on her. The ceremony began at 4 p.m. sharp. Sophie walked down the aisle on Henry's arm, radiant in her ivory gown, while Linda sat in the front row, clutching a tissue and stealing glances at David, seated 3 rows back. He was impeccable in his tailored suit, his confidence unshaken. After the ceremony, the reception unfolded in a blur of toasts, laughter, and dancing under a sprawling tent. By 7:45 p.m., Linda had downed 2 glasses of champagne and was feeling the warmth of the evening settling around her. She avoided David's gaze as much as possible, but his presence felt like a current pulling at her, impossible to ignore. At 8:10 p.m., the room fell silent as Matthew tapped his glass for attention. "If I could have everyone's eyes for a moment," he began, standing at the head table. "Sophie and I are so grateful to have all of you here tonight, and we're excited to share some news with you." Linda's stomach tightened. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth in surprise as Matthew continued. "We've decided to move in with my father," he announced, beaming. The room erupted in applause, but Linda felt her world tilt. Her champagne glass slipped slightly in her hand. Matthew turned toward a table near the back and gestured. "Dad, we can't thank you enough for opening your home to us." All eyes shifted to David Montgomery, who stood with a proud smile, raising his glass in acknowledgement. Linda's chest constricted as the reality hit her like a freight train. David wasn't just her boss. He wasn't just her lover. He was Matthew's father. Her throat went dry as David's eyes flicked to hers, just for a second, but long enough to send a silent message. Everything just changed. Linda clutched the edge of the table, her carefully constructed life teetering on the brink of collapse. The applause faded, but her pulse thundered in her ears. Across the room, Sophie's radiant smile blurred as Linda's vision swam. The clock above the dance floor struck 8:15 p.m. The truth had detonated silently, and there was no going back. The air felt thicker after the toast, suffocating even under the festive glow of fairy lights strung across the reception tent. Linda sat frozen, her heart hammering as Matthew's father, her lover, settled back into his seat, his proud smile undisturbed. She couldn't decide if his calm demeanor was admirable or infuriating. Sophie's voice cut through the din of applause. "Mom," she said, touching Linda's arm. "Isn't that amazing? Matthew's dad is so generous. We'll be able to save for a place of our own so much faster." Linda forced a smile, though her mind was racing. "It's wonderful," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Henry, oblivious to her turmoil, raised his glass. "David's a good man," he said, nodding toward the back of the tent. "I always liked him." Linda's stomach churned. Every word of praise from Henry felt like another layer of guilt pressing down on her. She excused herself quickly, muttering something about needing a moment of fresh air. At 8:20 p.m., Linda stood at the edge of the vineyard, the cool breeze doing little to calm her. She barely heard the footsteps behind her until David spoke. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Linda turned sharply, her eyes blazing. "What the hell was that?" she hissed. "You knew this whole time, didn't you?" David tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Knew what, Linda? That our kids were in love? Hardly something I could control. You could have told me." She snapped, her voice rising. "Instead, you let me walk into this blind." "Do you have any idea?" "Lower your voice," he interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "This isn't the time or place for dramatics." Linda laughed bitterly. "Dramatics? My daughter is moving in with you, and you don't think that warrants a little panic?" David stepped closer, his presence commanding even in the moonlight. "I handled it the best way I could. This isn't just about us anymore." "Us?" Linda spat, her anger overtaking her. "There is no us, David. Whatever this was, whatever I thought it was, it's over." David's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You don't mean that." "I do," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This can't continue. Not now, not ever." Before David could respond, another voice interrupted them. "Mom." Linda froze. Sophie stood a few feet away, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on?" Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at David, whose composed mask slipped just slightly, betraying a flicker of unease. "Nothing," Linda said finally, forcing a smile. "David and I were just discussing the toast." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "You seemed pretty upset for a conversation about a toast." Linda's mind raced, searching for a plausible excuse. "I'm just overwhelmed," she said. "It's a big day, you know. So many emotions." Sophie didn't look convinced, but before she could press further, Matthew appeared, draping an arm around her shoulders. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "Everyone's asking where the bride disappeared to." Sophie hesitated, glancing between Linda and David, before nodding. "We're coming." Linda watched them walk back toward the tent, her chest tight with dread. She could feel David's gaze on her, but didn't turn to meet it. "This isn't over," he said quietly before following the newlyweds. Linda stayed rooted to the spot, the weight of her secret threatening to crush her. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Back inside the tent, the mood had shifted. The band played an upbeat tune, and guests danced with a carefree joy that Linda envied. She returned to her table, where Henry was deep in conversation with Matthew's mother, Claire. "Linda, there you are," Claire said warmly. "What a wonderful day, isn't it?" Linda forced another smile. "Yes, it's perfect." Claire leaned in conspiratorially. "I have to admit, when Matthew told us about moving in with David, I was relieved. That house is too big for one person, and it'll be good for him to have the kids around." Linda's stomach turned. "Yes, it'll be good for everyone." Claire nodded, oblivious to Linda's discomfort. "And Sophie, she's such a lovely girl. You must be so proud." "Of course," Linda murmured, her voice hollow. Across the room, David caught her eye again. He raised his glass subtly, the gesture small but significant. Linda quickly looked away, her face flushing. As the night wore on, the knot in Linda's chest grew tighter. She knew she couldn't avoid David forever, but the thought of confronting the truth, of explaining herself to Sophie, to Henry, was unbearable. At 10:05 p.m., as the crowd began to thin and the newlyweds prepared to leave, Sophie approached Linda again. "Mom, can we talk for a second?" she asked, her tone unusually serious. Linda's heart sank. "Of course," she said, trying to sound casual. Sophie led her to a quiet corner of the tent. "What's going on with you and Matthew's dad?" Linda's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," Sophie said, her eyes sharp. "I saw you outside earlier. You looked weird. And the way you've been avoiding him all night." "There's nothing going on," Linda interrupted, her voice trembling. "You're imagining things." Sophie studied her mother for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "If you say so." But Linda could see the doubt lingering in her daughter's eyes. And as Sophie walked away, Linda realized with a sinking heart that the web of lies she'd spun was beginning to unravel. The morning after the wedding, Linda woke to an eerie silence. Her body ached with tension, and her mind was a tangle of unfinished thoughts. Henry was already up, humming cheerfully in the kitchen as he prepared breakfast, a mundane sound that only amplified her unease. The memory of Sophie's sharp gaze and David's quiet toast haunted her. She felt trapped, teetering on the edge of disaster, unsure how to keep her secrets buried when the ground beneath her was already crumbling. By 9:30 a.m., Linda's phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Come by the house at noon. Matthew and I want to talk to you and Dad." Her heart sank. A talk? Linda couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie knew more than she let on. "Who's that?" Henry asked, flipping pancakes. "Sophie," Linda replied, forcing a smile. "She wants us to visit." "Well, of course," Henry said brightly. "Let me finish up here, and we'll head over." Linda nodded, her stomach churning. She could only hope the visit was about something trivial, maybe honeymoon plans or their future move. But deep down, she knew better. The couple's new home was a charming two-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac, one they planned to rent while saving for their own place. As Linda and Henry stepped inside at 12:05 p.m., Sophie greeted them warmly, her earlier suspicions masked by her usual cheerfulness. Come in," Sophie said, gesturing toward the living room, where Matthew sat with coffee mugs on a tray. "So," Henry said, settling into an armchair, "what's this big conversation about?" Matthew exchanged a glance with Sophie, who took a deep breath before speaking. "Actually, it's about Matthew's dad." Linda froze. "He called this morning," Sophie continued, her tone cautious, "and he wants to host a family dinner next week at his place." "Oh, that sounds lovely," Henry said, oblivious to Linda's discomfort. Sophie hesitated. "There's something else. He mentioned that you two already know each other." Linda felt Henry's curious gaze land on her. "Oh, yes," Henry said casually. "David's Linda's boss." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" Linda forced a laugh, her palms clammy. "What else would it be, darling?" For a moment, Sophie studied her mother with that same piercing gaze as the night before. Then she smiled. "Nothing, I guess. Just thought it was funny he didn't mention it until now." Matthew chuckled. "Dad's not always the most forthcoming guy, but he's excited to have us move in." Henry raised his coffee mug. "Well, here's to new beginnings." Linda echoed the sentiment, though her heart pounded with dread. The next week passed in a haze of mounting anxiety. Linda considered canceling the dinner, feigning illness, or inventing a last-minute work emergency, but she knew that would only fuel Sophie's suspicions. By the time Thursday evening arrived, she was resigned to facing whatever disaster awaited. At 6:45 p.m., the family pulled up to David's sprawling estate. The house was grand yet inviting, with a perfectly manicured lawn and warm lights glowing from the windows. "Wow," Henry said as they stepped out of the car. "This place is impressive." Linda's stomach churned as David opened the door, his smile as confident as ever. "Welcome," he said warmly, shaking Henry's hand before turning to Linda. "Good to see you again." Linda managed a polite nod, avoiding his gaze as they stepped inside. Dinner began uneventfully. David charmed everyone with his wit, recounting anecdotes about Matthew's childhood that had Sophie in stitches. Even Linda found herself laughing once or twice, though the tension in her chest never eased. But as the meal wound down, David leaned back in his chair and fixed Linda with a pointed look. "Linda," he said, his tone casual but laced with something deeper, "I hear you've been working on that big campaign at the office. How's it going?" Linda froze. She could feel Sophie and Henry watching her. "It's going well," she said cautiously. "Ah," David said with a knowing smile. "You always do have a way of handling stressful situations." The words hung in the air, innocuous to the others, but heavy with implication for Linda. Henry raised an eyebrow. Sounds like David knows you pretty well, Linda. We work closely, David said smoothly, his eyes still on Linda. Linda's been invaluable to the team. Linda's pulse quickened. Was he taunting her? Testing her? By the time dessert was served, Linda excused herself to the restroom, desperate for a moment to collect herself. But as she stepped into the hallway, David followed, his footsteps soft but deliberate. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. No, we don't, Linda hissed, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching. David's expression hardened. You're unraveling, Linda. I can see it. If you don't pull yourself together, someone's going to figure this out. Why do you even care? She whispered furiously. You're the one who got me into this mess. David leaned closer, his voice sharp. You're the one who decided to keep it going, Linda. Don't forget that. Before she could respond, Sophie's voice echoed from the dining room. Mom, where are you? Linda shot David a warning glare before stepping back into the room, plastering a smile on her face. The evening ended without further incident, but the drive home was tense. That was a nice dinner, Henry said, oblivious to the storm brewing beside him. Linda forced a smile. Yes, it was. But in the back seat, Sophie sat silently, her eyes narrowed as she stared out the window. Linda didn't know it yet, but her daughter was piecing things together, and the explosion was coming sooner than she imagined. The following morning, Linda awoke to a sense of unease that had become all too familiar. She barely touched her coffee as Henry read the paper, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their roof. By 9 a.m., Sophie called. Her tone was unusually curt. Mom, can you come over? Just you. I need to talk to you. Linda's stomach twisted. Of course, sweetheart. Is everything okay? Sophie hesitated. Just come by when you can. The line went dead, leaving Linda staring at her phone. Her hands trembled as she set the cup down. I'm heading to Sophie's, she told Henry, keeping her voice neutral. Tell her we said hi, Henry replied, smiling behind the paper. Linda forced a smile, but her heart raced as she grabbed her keys. At 9:45 a.m., Linda arrived at Sophie and Matthew's cozy house. The air outside felt heavier than usual, the autumn sun struggling to pierce the clouds. Sophie opened the door immediately, her expression tense. Come in, she said, stepping aside. Linda followed her to the living room, where Sophie sat stiffly on the couch. A single envelope lay on the coffee table between them. Mom, Sophie began, her voice steady but cold. I need you to tell me the truth. Linda froze. The truth about what? About you and Matthew's dad, Sophie said bluntly. The words hit Linda like a physical blow. She struggled to keep her composure. What are you talking about, Sophie? Don't lie to me. Sophie snapped, her voice rising. I've been watching you. The way you act around him. The way he looks at you. And last night, she trailed off, her hands shaking. Last night, when you two disappeared for a few minutes, I followed you. Linda's breath caught. I saw you arguing in the hallway, Sophie continued, and I heard enough to know something's going on. Sophie, Linda said, her voice trembling, it's not what you think. Then what is it? Sophie demanded. Linda faltered, her carefully constructed lies crumbling under her daughter's piercing gaze. It's complicated, she finally admitted. That's not an answer, Sophie said, her voice breaking. How could you do this, Mom? How could you betray Dad like this? Tears spilled down Linda's cheeks as she reached for Sophie's hand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was lonely. I made a mistake. A mistake? Sophie repeated, pulling her hand away. A mistake that's been going on for months? Linda's silence was damning. The door opened, and Matthew walked in, his expression confused. What's going on? He asked, glancing between them. Sophie turned to him, her eyes red. Ask my mother. Ask her why she's been sneaking around with your father. Matthew froze, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. What? It's true, isn't it? Sophie pressed, looking at Linda. Tell him. Linda felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her. Matthew, she began, her voice cracking. It's not what it seems. Stop lying. Sophie shouted. Matthew stepped back, shaking his head. This can't be real. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Linda said, her tears falling freely now. It just happened. Matthew's expression darkened. Does my dad know you were going to let this come out? Or were you planning to keep this secret forever? I didn't want it to come out at all, Linda admitted. Sophie let out a bitter laugh. Well, it's out now. And you've destroyed everything. By the time Linda returned home, it was well past noon. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. Henry greeted her with his usual cheer, but she couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. You're quiet, he said, setting his book aside. Everything okay with Sophie? She's fine, Linda lied, her voice strained. Henry studied her for a moment, but didn't press. At 6 p.m., Sophie's car pulled into the driveway. Linda's chest tightened as she watched her daughter walk up the path, her expression unreadable. When the door opened, Sophie stepped inside and faced her mother. We need to talk. Henry appeared in the hallway, his smile fading when he saw Sophie's serious expression. What's going on? Sophie hesitated, glancing between her parents. Dad, you should sit down. Henry frowned. What is this about? Sophie's voice wavered. It's about Mom. Linda felt the room spin as Henry turned to her, confusion etched across his face. What's she talking about, Linda? Sophie didn't wait for her mother to answer. Mom's been having an affair, she said flatly, with Matthew's dad. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Henry stared at Linda, his face pale. Is this true? Linda's lips moved, but no sound came out. Linda! Henry's voice rose. Is it true? Yes, Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. I can't believe this, he muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. How long? Does it matter? Sophie interjected bitterly. Henry turned to her, his eyes filled with pain. You knew? I just found out, Sophie said. Henry shook his head, his face crumbling. I need some air, he said, grabbing his coat and storming out the door. Sophie glared at Linda. I hope it was worth it, she said coldly before following her father. Linda stood alone in the silent house, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had feared this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the pain of seeing her family fall apart. The silence in the house was deafening after Sophie and Henry left. Linda sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, the reality of her choices crashing down around her. Every word Sophie had thrown at her replayed in her mind, each one sharper than the last. By 8:30 p.m., the front door creaked open. Linda looked up to see Henry walk in, his face pale and drawn. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before finally speaking. Why, Linda? He asked, his voice trembling. Why would you do this to us? Linda's throat tightened. I never meant for this to happen, Henry. I never wanted to hurt you. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt Sophie, our family. Was it worth it? For him? Tears welled in Linda's eyes. It wasn't about him. It was about me, feeling alive again. I felt like I disappeared, Henry, like I wasn't even a person anymore. Henry's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the back of a chair. So you threw away 30 years of marriage? 30 years, Linda. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know what else to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the betrayal filled the space between them, a chasm too wide to bridge. At 9:15 p.m., Sophie returned, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She dropped into the chair across from Linda, her expression a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Dad's staying at Aunt Carol's tonight, Sophie said flatly. Linda nodded, her guilt suffocating. I'm so sorry, Sophie, for everything. Sophie scoffed, shaking her head. You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? Matthew and I, we're supposed to be starting our lives together, and now I don't even know if I can look at his father without thinking of you. I know, Linda said quietly. And I'll do whatever I can to make this right. Make this right? Sophie's voice rose. How? Are you going to undo the affair? Are you going to erase the image of you sneaking around with Matthew's dad? Linda's tears spilled over. I'll talk to Matthew. I'll talk to David. I'll do anything. Don't you dare talk to Matthew, Sophie interrupted, her tone icy. You've done enough damage. Linda flinched at the venom in her daughter's voice. The following evening, at 6 p.m., Linda sat in her car outside David's estate, summoning the courage to confront him. She hadn't told Sophie or Henry where she was going, knowing it would only make things worse. But she couldn't leave things unresolved. David answered the door with his usual confidence, though his smile faltered when he saw Linda's expression. We need to talk, Linda said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. David closed the door, leaning against it. I take it things didn't go well? Linda spun to face him, her anger barely contained. They know, David. Sophie knows. Henry knows. Everything's falling apart. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I figured it was only a matter of time. You knew, Linda said, her voice trembling. You knew this would happen, and you didn't stop it. David's eyes hardened. Don't put this all on me, Linda. You were a willing participant. I trusted you, she shouted. I trusted you to what? He interrupted, his tone sharp. To make you feel alive? To give you something your husband couldn't? Don't pretend you didn't want this as much as I did. Linda's chest heaved with fury. This was a mistake. All of it. David laughed bitterly. A mistake? Is that what you're telling yourself now? Fine. Go ahead. Run back to your perfect little family and see if they'll forgive you. But don't expect me to clean up your mess. Linda stared at him, her anger giving way to a hollow ache. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the sound of the door slamming behind her echoing in the empty night. The next week passed in a blur of cold silence. Henry remained at his sister's house, while Sophie kept her distance, responding to Linda's text with curt, one-word replies. It wasn't until Friday evening, at 7 p.m., that the doorbell rang. Linda opened it to find Sophie standing there, her face calm but unreadable. Can I come in? Sophie asked. Linda stepped aside, her heart pounding. Of course. They sat in the living room, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. I've been thinking, Sophie began, her voice steady, about what you did, about what it means for us. Linda's throat tightened. Sophie, let me finish, Sophie said firmly. I'm angry. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry, but you're my mom, and I can't just walk away from that. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not forgiving you, Sophie said bluntly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm not cutting you out of my life either. Linda nodded, her tears spilling over. That's more than I deserve. Sophie stood, her face softening slightly. It's a start. As she walked to the door, Linda felt a glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage of her choices. It would take time, maybe years, but perhaps someday they could rebuild what had been broken. The days following Sophie's visit brought a fragile sense of calm, though the cracks in Linda's life remained painfully visible. Henry still hadn't returned home, and his silence spoke volumes. Sophie's decision to maintain contact offered a small reprieve, but Linda knew their relationship hung by a thread. By Wednesday evening, at 7:30 p.m., Linda sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at a photo of her family on the mantel. It had been taken 3 years earlier during a vacation to the mountains. Everyone looked happy, carefree. Now, the memory felt like a cruel joke. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. The screen lit up with an incoming call from Sophie. Hi, sweetheart, Linda said, her voice tentative. Mom, Sophie began, her tone guarded. Matthew and I talked. We've decided to move out of David's house. Linda's heart leapt. That's good news. It's not because of you, Sophie clarified quickly. Matthew thinks living there would be too complicated, and honestly, I agree. I understand, Linda said softly. There was a pause before Sophie spoke again. Dad's coming over tomorrow. He wants to talk to you. Linda's breath hitched. He does. Yes, Sophie said, her voice quieter now. Just don't screw this up, okay? I won't, Linda promised, though her chest tightened with anxiety. The next evening, at precisely 6:15 p.m., Henry arrived. He looked older somehow, the weight of betrayal etched into the lines of his face. Linda opened the door, her hands trembling as she stepped aside to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, a chasm of silence stretching between them. Finally, Henry broke it. I didn't come here to yell, he said, his voice measured but firm. Linda nodded, her throat too tight to speak. I've had time to think, Henry continued, about everything, about us. Tears welled in Linda's eyes, but she held them back. I'm so sorry, Henry, for all of it. I know, he said, his gaze steady. But sorry doesn't fix this, Linda. It doesn't erase what you did. I know that too, she said quietly. Henry leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. I can't just forget this. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I also know that 30 years of marriage isn't something you throw away lightly. Linda's heart ached at the flicker of hope in his words. Henry, I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, time, space, anything. I just want a chance to make this right. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. We'll take it one step at a time. No promises, but we'll try. The relief that washed over Linda was tempered by the knowledge that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. As Henry left that evening, Linda stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street. She felt lighter, as though the crushing weight of her mistakes had lifted just slightly. But she knew this wasn't the end of her reckoning. It was only the beginning. The following week, at 8 p.m., Sophie and Matthew came over for dinner. The atmosphere was tense but civil, with Matthew making a visible effort to mask his discomfort. I found a great little apartment downtown, Matthew said, slicing into his steak. It's small, but it's perfect for now. That's wonderful, Linda said, forcing a smile. Yeah, Sophie added, her tone clipped, away from all the drama. Matthew shot her a warning glance, and she sighed. Sorry, I'm still adjusting to everything. I understand, Linda said, her voice calm. And I know I have a lot to make up for. I just hope we can find a way forward. Sophie didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly. 2 weeks later, David's presence reappeared like an unwelcome shadow. He sent Linda an email, its tone casual but with an undercurrent of tension. Linda, I think we should talk. Loose ends like this don't tie themselves. You know where to find me. David. Linda stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She deleted the email without replying. That night, she confided in Henry about the message, a decision that felt monumental after weeks of silence. He reached out, she said hesitantly. Henry frowned. What did he want? To talk, Linda admitted. But I didn't respond. Good, Henry said firmly. He's not part of our lives anymore. His words were a balm to Linda's frayed nerves. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of unity with her husband. Months passed, and though the wounds of betrayal remained, they began to scab over. Linda and Henry attended counseling sessions, each step a small victory in rebuilding their fractured bond. Sophie and Matthew thrived in their new apartment, though Sophie's relationship with Linda remained guarded. One afternoon, as Linda walked through the park near their home, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench. David. Her chest tightened, but she kept walking, her head held high. He called out to her, his voice tinged with something that might have been regret. Linda. She paused but didn't turn around. There's nothing left to say, David. And with that, she walked away, leaving him in the chaos he represented behind. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. Linda learned to live with her choices, the guilt a quiet companion that reminded her of what she almost lost. And though the scars would never fully heal, the threads of her family began to weave together again, stronger in their fragility.